January 17, 1945, 30 kilometers east of Strasbourg. The morning air hung thick with diesel fumes and the metallic temps of frozen mud. Oberstleutnant Klaus Hartmann stood in the commander's cupola of his Panzer tank, watching the snow-dusted forests of Alsace roll past like a grainy new. Behind him, 73 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division stretched in a perfect mechanical column, Panther Mark versus Tiger E's, and the new experimental Jag-Panzers that Hitler himself had promised would cleave through American lines like a blade through butter. The engines roared in synchronized precision, each exhaust note a testament to German engineering superiority. Hartmann could taste victory in the cold air. He had tasted it before in Poland, in France, in those glorious early months in Russia before the winter came. The Americans, he had been told, were shopkeepers and farmers dressed in olive drab. They would break. They always broke. He did not know that in 96 hours his division would cease to exist. The 10th Panzer Division was not just another armored unit. It was a cathedral of Nazi military doctrine made of flesh and steel. Formed in Prague in 1939, it had carved through the Ardennes in 1940, reduced French fortresses to rubble, and held the line at Kursk when lesser divisions dissolved into chaos. Its soldiers wore the Death's Head insignia with fierce pride, not the SS variant, but the Totenkopf of the old Prussian Guard, a symbol stretching back to Frederick the Great. They were not fanatics. They were professionals, men who had studied Clausewitz and Guderian and who could field strip a Maybach HL230 engine blindfolded, who believed that discipline and technological supremacy would always triumph over raw numbers. The division's combat record was studied in Wehrmacht academies. Its tactics were taught to officer cadets. When high command needed a breakthrough, they called the 10th. When a line needed to hold against impossible odds, they sent the 10th. And in January 1945, as the Western Front threatened to collapse entirely, they deployed the 10th one final time. Die Mission war das Unternehmen Nordwind Operation Northwind. While the world's attention focused on the Battle of the Bulge to the north, German strategists planned a devastating thrust through Alsace to cut off Patton's Third Army from its supply bases. The 10th Panzer would be the spearhead. They would strike at dawn through the Vosges foothills, bypass American strongpoints, and drive west toward Nancy, collapsing the entire southern flank. The plan was audacious, brilliant, and entirely possible on paper. The men of the 10th believed in it completely. They had seen American units crumble at Kasserine Pass. They had watched Shermans burn like rolling coffins at Villiers. Yes, the Americans had numbers, but numbers meant nothing without the will to use them. And everyone knew Americans lacked the German capacity for sacrifice. They would quit when the casualties mounted. They always did. Hartmann remembered the briefing in the schoolhouse in Heg. The regimental commander, a veteran of Stalingrad who walked with a pronounced limp, had drawn the attack routes on a chalkboard with the confidence of a mathematics professor proving a theorem. The Americans are spread thin here, he had said, tapping the chalk against the map. Their 44th Infantry Division holds a front of 48 kilometers with fewer than 12,000 men. They are exhausted from fighting in the Ardennes. Their reserves are non-existent. We will hit them with concentrated force at 3 points simultaneously. Their line will shatter. The officers nodded. The logic was impeccable. The numbers favored them. The Tigers could engage Shermans at ranges where the Americans couldn't even return fire. The Panthers' sloped armor could deflect hits that would gut an M4. And the men were still the finest fighting force in Europe, lean and hard from years of war, motivated by the certain knowledge that defeat meant the end of everything they knew. What the briefing did not mention, what no German intelligence officer had adequately understood, was what had happened to the American army in the 20 months since D-Day, the force that had stumbled onto Omaha Beach, that had cowered in the Normandy hedgerows, that had learned war through bloody attrition. That army no longer existed. In its place was something the Wehrmacht had never encountered before, an industrial military machine that had learned every lesson, absorbed every setback, and transformed itself into an instrument of systematic annihilation. The Americans the 10th Panzer would face in those 96 hours were not the uncertain liberators of June 1944, were veterans of Mortain and Nancy and Metz. They had learned to fight in cities and forests and frozen fields. They had learned that armor alone meant nothing without infantry support. That artillery won battles, that logistics determined wars, and they had learned something else, something that would prove far more devastating than any tactical doctrine. They had learned they could not lose. The first shells fell at 0230 hours on January 18. American forward observers spotted the German assembly areas through the morning fog and called down fire from battalions deployed in carefully surveyed positions. The 155mm rounds came in like the wrath of an industrial god, not in ones or twos, but in sustained barrages that turned the forests into mud. Hartmann's tank shuddered as a near miss geysered frozen earth across the turret. He had experienced artillery before Russian Katyushas, British naval guns off Cannes, but this was different. This was methodical, mechanical. The shells arrived in precise patterns, walking across assembly areas with mathematical efficiency. Each explosion seemed to blend into the next until the world became nothing but noise and concussion and the constant ringing in the ears that announced permanent damage. The radio crackled with confused reports. The third company had lost 6 tanks before even reaching the line of departure. The supply column was burning. The planned artillery preparation of 60 minutes of coordinated fire from German guns was reduced to sporadic bursts as American counter-battery fire systematically destroyed each position within minutes of its first shot. But the 10th pressed forward. That was what professionals did. Hartmann's company crossed the line at 0400 hours. Engines screaming, tracks churning the frozen earth. For the first 2 hours, it seemed the plan might still work. American positions fell back before them. Infantry scattered into the woods. A Sherman platoon exchanged fire at long range, then withdrew when a Tiger destroyed the lead tank with a single shot through the mantlet. The radio was filled with reports of breakthroughs, advances, and villages captured. Hartmann allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Yes, the Americans had artillery, but they lacked the German will to stand and die. They would run, and running armies could be pursued to destruction. He did not yet understand that the Americans were not running. They were repositioning. They were implementing a doctrine developed through 2 years of bitter experience. Bend but do not break. Channel the enemy into killing zones. Treat him with firepower rather than manpower. And once his momentum breaks, once his tanks run out of fuel, and his infantry is exhausted and his supply lines are overextended, then counterattack with overwhelming force. The 44th Infantry Division had trained for exactly this scenario. Every company commander knew the fallback positions. Every artillery battalion had pre-plotted fires covering the likely avenues of approach. Every tank destroyer platoon had hold-down positions surveyed and ranged. The Americans were not better fighters than the Germans, not man for man, but they were fighting with a system, and systems defeated individuals every time. The second day began with a snowstorm that reduced visibility to 50 meters. Hartmann's company was somewhere north of Riedseltz, though the maps no longer matched the terrain. Navigation became a nightmare. The point tank hit a mine. American engineers had sown thousands during the night withdrawal and blocked the forest road, while the recovery team worked to clear the wreck. American 155s began dropping airbursts overhead, shredding anyone exposed outside the vehicles. Hartmann called for air support. The radio operator informed him that the Luftwaffe had 8 serviceable fighters for the entire sector. He called for ammunition resupply. The logistics officer reported the supply column was still burning 5 kilometers to the rear. He called for orders. The regimental headquarters had been hit by a P-47 strike and gone off the air entirely, and then the American tanks arrived. They came not in 2s or 3s but in platoons and companies, M for Shermans and the new M26 Pershings, supported by swarms of M10 and M18 tank destroyers. Individually, they were still inferior to German armor. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor, but the Americans didn't fight individually. They fought in combined arms teams, tanks working with infantry, artillery on call within 30 seconds, air support vectored by forward controllers with radio sets that seemed to work every single time. A Panther would engage a Sherman at long range and watch the round deflect harmlessly. Then 3 more Shermans would appear from different angles, firing, moving, firing again, while infantry with bazookas closed through the forest, and artillery walked toward the German position and AP-47 screamed overhead, looking for targets. The Germans called it the Meteorschlacht, the material battle, and they had always believed their superior skill would overcome it. In Alsace, in January 1945, that belief died hard. Hartmann's tank killed for Shermans on the second day. It felt like victory until he realized his company had been reduced from 14 tanks to 7, and they had advanced precisely 6 kilometers in 18 hours. The mathematics was brutal. The Americans could afford to trade for Shermans for 1 Panther. They had factories in Detroit that could replace those Shermans in a week. Germany had nothing left. The men knew it. You could see it in their eyes during the brief halts. The slow recognition that the rules had changed, that the old certainties no longer applied, that all their training and courage and technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy who simply refused to quit. The third day brought horror in forms both large and small. Hartmann's company was pinned in a forest clearing by accurate mortar fire when the American infantry came, not in human wave attacks like the Russians, but in squads armed with the new Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garands that gave every rifleman the firepower of a light machine gun. They moved through the trees using fire and maneuver tactics that would have impressed a Prussian drill instructor, one team providing covering fire while another advanced, then switching roles, constantly moving, never presenting a static target. The German infantry, depleted and exhausted, broke after 30 minutes. The tanks had to withdraw without their protective screen. That was when the American fighter bombers found them. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not an elegant aircraft. It looked like a flying anvil, brutish, crude, aesthetically offensive to the German eye, but it carried 8.50 caliber machine guns and could lug 5-inch rockets or 1,000-pound bombs. And in January 1945, there seemed to be hundreds of them in the sky at all times. They worked in pairs, one diving to attack while the other circled high cover, and they stayed on station for hours, loitering over the battlefield like vultures, attacking anything that moved. Hartmann watched a Thunderbolt put a rocket through the engine deck of a Tiger, brewing it up in seconds, the crew burning as they tried to escape. Another caught an ammunition truck and turned it into a pillar of fire visible for kilometers. The radio crackled with panicked calls of aircraft overhead, aircraft attacking, needing air cover. Whereas the Luftwaffe, but the Luftwaffe was dead, shot out of the sky or grounded for lack of fuel, and the Americans owned the air completely and utterly. But what broke the men of the 10th was not the aircraft or the tanks or even the artillery. It was the small things, the accumulation of tiny shocks that eroded belief in German superiority until nothing remained but the hollow knowledge of defeat. It was opening the emergency rations and finding nothing but sawdust-filled bread and ersatz, coffee made from acorns, while American prisoners were eating chocolate bars and canned peaches, their pockets stuffed with cigarettes and candy. It was seeing a captured Sherman and realizing the interior was spacious and well-designed, with vision blocks that actually worked and an escape hatch you could fit through, while the Panther's crew compartment was a cramped metal coffin where wounded men bled to death because there was no room to treat them. It was watching American wounded being evacuated by jeep ambulances fitted with stretcher racks and morphine supplies while German wounded lay in the snow waiting for horse-drawn carts that never came. It was the radios. Dear God. The radios. Every American tank had one. Every platoon commander could talk to his company commander, who could talk to the battalion commander, who could call down divisional artillery within 3 minutes. The Americans coordinated attacks across kilometers in real time, shifting forces to exploit opportunities or reinforce weak points with a flexibility that seemed almost supernatural. The Germans had better radio equipment, technically superior, as always, but there were never enough sets, and the ones they had kept breaking down, and the repair parts had been sent to the wrong depot, and by the third day Hartmann was reduced to sending runners on foot to communicate with adjacent units. It was the logistics. On the morning of the third day, Hartmann's company ran out of fuel, not low on fuel, completely out. The promised supply convoy had been destroyed by air attack. An emergency delivery by truck made it halfway before American artillery turned the vehicles into burning wrecks. The tanks sat immobile in their positions, mechanical masterpieces rendered useless for want of gasoline. Meanwhile, American units maneuvered at will, their fuel supplies delivered by an endless convoy of trucks rolling forward on roads cleared by engineer battalions, protected by air cover, guided by traffic control teams that kept everything flowing with assembly line efficiency. The Wehrmacht was still using horses. Hartmann had seen thousands of horses, malnourished and sickly, struggling to pull artillery pieces through the snow. The Americans used trucks for everything. They had so many trucks that they ran empty ones forward just to avoid having them clog the rear areas. The contrast was so total, so absolute, that it seemed almost insulting. On the fourth day, the counterattack came. The Americans had spent 72 hours absorbing the German assault, letting it expend itself against prepared positions, bleeding it white through attrition. Now came the hammer blow. The 6th Armored Division struck from the north while fresh infantry divisions pushed from the east. The attack was preceded by a 2-hour artillery barrage that turned the world into a vision of the apocalypse. Hartmann huddled in his disabled tank, hands pressed over his ears, counting the seconds between impacts, knowing that mathematics alone said one would eventually land directly on target. The tank rocked with near misses. Shrapnel pinged off the armor like deadly hail. Men screamed over the radio, incoherent, Panicked screams that spoke of positions overrun and comrades dead and the line collapsing. When the barrage lifted, the American armor came through the smoke like iron demons, not charging wildly, but advancing in bounds. Infantry and tanks mutually supporting, artillery shifting forward to isolate German positions, combat engineers right behind two clear mines and obstacles. It was a machine, a brutal, unstoppable, utterly impersonal machine, and the men who operated it were not supermen. They were butchers' sons from Chicago and farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pittsburgh, but they had been trained to a standard and equipped to a level that made individual heroism irrelevant. The system would prevail. The system always prevailed. Hartmann remembered a moment on that fourth day that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His company had been surrounded in a village whose name he never learned. The Americans were closing in from three sides. His crew had rigged demolition charges to destroy the Panther rather than let it be captured. As they prepared to withdraw on foot, an American Sherman rolled into the village square 50 meters away. Hartmann raised his Panzerfaust, ready to die, selling his life dearly in the old tradition. Then he saw the Sherman commander standing in his turret hatch. A boy really couldn't have been more than 20, eating an orangey in January, in the middle of a battle. The American casually tossed the peel aside, spoke into his microphone, and the Sherman's turret traversed with hydraulic smoothness toward Hartmann's position. The German officer dropped the Panzerfaust and ran, not because he was a coward, but because in that moment he understood with crystal clarity that the war was over. Any nation that could deliver fresh oranges to its frontline troops in the middle of winter, in the middle of a battle, in the middle of Europe, that nation could not be defeated by courage or skill or determination. That nation had won before the first shot was fired. The 10th Panzer Division ceased to exist as a combat formation at 1600 hours on January 21, 1945, 96 hours after it had crossed the line of departure with 7 tanks and the absolute confidence of professional soldiers. It no longer appeared on Wehrmacht order of battle maps. The survivors, perhaps 2,000 men from an original strength of 8,000, straggled back toward German lines in small groups, abandoning equipment, discarding weapons, interested only in survival. The tanks were gone, all of them, destroyed, captured, or abandoned for lack of fuel. The artillery was gone, the transport was gone, the division's history, its traditions, its carefully cultivated identity as an elite formation, all of it erased in 4 days of systematic destruction. Hartmann survived. He was captured by American MPs at a roadblock near Saragamans, too exhausted to resist, too numb to care. The Americans processed him with bureaucratic efficiency, searched, documented, tagged, and loaded onto a truck heading for a POW camp in France. In the truck bed, squeezed between 30 other prisoners, he noticed details his training had taught him to observe. The truck was new, fresh from some factory across the Atlantic. The tires were inflated properly. The engine ran smoothly. The American guards were well fed, their uniforms clean, their equipment maintained. They offered the prisoners water from canteens that didn't leak and rations that included cigarettes and chocolate. One guard, a corporal from New Jersey with a German surname, spoke to them in accented German, asking if anyone needed medical attention. The humanity of it, the casual assumption that even enemies deserved basic dignity, was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. The POW camp was near Reims, a sprawling complex of tents and prefabricated buildings that housed 15,000 German prisoners. Hartmann spent the remaining months of the war there, working in the motor pool, repairing the same trucks and jeeps that had defeated him. The Americans were not harsh captors. The food was more than adequate compared to what German civilians were eating. The medical care was better than what the Wehrmacht provided its own troops. There were educational classes, recreational activities, and a lending library with books in German. The guards treated them not as conquered monsters, but as defeated soldiers, worthy of a certain professional respect. It was disorienting. Everything Hartmann had been taught about Americans, that they were soft, decadent, incapable of sustained sacrifice, was revealed as propaganda, so disconnected from reality that he felt ashamed for ever believing it. He met other survivors in the camp. What remained of the 10th Panzer was scattered across several compounds. In the evenings, they would gather in small groups and try to understand what had happened. Not the tactical details were clear enough, but the deeper question of how the world's finest military force had been so completely and utterly crushed. Some blamed Hitler for interfering with operational decisions. Others blamed the generals for not standing up to Hitler. A few blamed the weather, or bad luck, or the inevitable result of fighting a two-front war against overwhelming numbers. But Hartmann had come to a different conclusion. One he articulated late one night to a group of junior officers who still looked to him for wisdom. "We lost," he said quietly, "because we were fighting an idea, and you cannot kill an idea with superior tactics. The Americans did not defeat us with courage or skill. They defeated us with production, capacity, and political will. They defeated us because every soldier knew he was fighting for something real, for homes they would return to, for freedoms they had known all their lives, for a system that valued the individual human being. And we were fighting for what? For the Führer, for Le Bon, for a 1,000-year Reich that was already dying. We were magnificent soldiers, perhaps the best who ever lived, but we were serving a cause that deserved to lose. And in the end, that made all the difference." The orange haunted him. He would think about it for decades afterward, that an American boy commander was casually eating fresh fruit in the middle of winter in the middle of a battle. The absolute confidence of someone who knew his nation's industrial might would always keep him supplied, fed, supported. The orange was in abundance. It was transformed into a symbol. It was the distilled essence of American power, not military genius or tactical brilliance, but the simple, brutal fact of overwhelming material superiority married to a political system that could sustain it indefinitely. Germany could produce better tanks, it could train better soldiers, it could plan better operations, but it could never, ever compete with a nation that could deliver oranges to the front after the war. Hartmann returned to Bavaria and became a teacher. He never spoke publicly about his experiences until the 1970s, when a generation of historians began documenting the Wehrmacht's final campaigns. In a series of interviews that became foundational texts for military historians, he described Operation North Wind and the destruction of the 10th Panzer Division. His accounts were notable for their honesty. No myths of betrayal or stab-in-the-back theories, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement that Germany had been outfought by an enemy it never understood. He died in 1983, and among his personal effects was a single photograph, an orange sitting on the turret of a Sherman tank, taken by some unknown American soldier and traded to a German prisoner for a packet of cigarettes. He had kept it for 38 years. The Battle of Alsace on Tournemire Nordwind and its aftermath receives relatively little attention in popular histories of World War II. It lacks the dramatic resonance of Normandy or the Bulge. It was not a turning point. By January 1945, the war's outcome was already determined. But for the men who fought there, and particularly for the soldiers of the 10th Panzer Division, it represented something profound. The final death of the myth of German invincibility. Not the first crack in that myth, Stalingrad and Kursk had done that, but the absolute demolition of the belief that skill and courage could overcome material inferiority. The Americans in Alsace were not the uncertain amateurs of Kasserine. They were a fully mature military force, combining material superiority with hard-won tactical competence, and they destroyed an elite German division with almost casual efficiency. The 96 hours that erased the 10th Panzer Division revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare. That industrial capacity had become more important than warrior spirit, that logistics determined strategy, that systematic organization defeated individual brilliance every time. The Germans had spent centuries perfecting the art of war as conducted by professional soldiers in service to the state. The Americans, in less than 4 years, had transformed war into an industrial process, no different from manufacturing automobiles or harvesting wheat. It was not noble, it was not glorious, but it was effective beyond anything the old military traditions could counter. And so the Panther tanks burned in French forests, their crews dead or captured, their carefully engineered components scattered across muddy fields, and the Shermans rolled forward, mechanically inferior but sufficiently numerous and adequately supported, their crews alive to fight another day because their nation valued their lives, enough to give them radios and spare parts and medical evacuation and fresh oranges in January. The Americans won not because they were better warriors, many were not, but because they represented a system that could wage industrial war more efficiently than any opponent. They won because democracy, for all its inefficiencies, proved more sustainable than dictatorship. They won because abundance triumphed over excellence, because quantity had a quality all its own, because in the end, the nation that could feed its soldiers oranges in winter could feed them bullets and shells without limit. The survivors of the 10th Panzer Division, scattered across the decades that followed, some emigrated, some remained in Germany to rebuild, some took their own lives when the weight of memory became unbearable. But in their twilight years, When historians came to document their experiences, a pattern emerged in their testimonies. They spoke with respect, even admiration, for the American soldiers they had fought, not because the Americans were superior warriors, but because they represented something the Wehrmacht could never duplicate, a military force whose power derived not from Prussian discipline or tactical genius, but from the simple equation of industrial democracy. The Americans won because their system worked better, because trucks beat horses, because radios beat runners, because a nation that valued every individual soldier's life would always outfight a system that treated men as expendable resources. In the end, the destruction of the 10th Panzer Division was not a story of heroism or cowardice, victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It was a story of systems in collision with the old world of professional militaries and warrior elites versus the new world of industrial warfare and democratic mass armies. The Germans fought superbly. They died bravely. They employed their inferior resources with maximum efficiency, and they were destroyed anyway, not by a greater fighting spirit but by an opponent who could afford to lose 4 tanks to kill one, who could replace casualties faster than they could be inflicted, who could deliver hot food and medical care and ammunition and fresh fruit to the front while the Wehrmacht's soldiers scrounged for bread and burned furniture for warmth. The orange on the Sherman's turret was not just fruit, it was a prophecy. It was the future arriving ahead of schedule, bright and confident and utterly indifferent to tradition. It was abundance weaponized. It was the sound of factory whistles in Detroit and Pittsburgh drowning out the martial music of the Wehrmacht. It was the simple, brutal truth that, in modern war, the nation that can keep its soldiers fed and supplied will outlast the nation with the better soldiers every single time. The men of the 10th Panzer Division learned that truth in 96 hours of fire and steel and systematic destruction. They learned it too late to save themselves, but perhaps just in time to teach it to history if history is willing to listen.